Many times, young people struggle with trying to know what their calling is or whether they even have one.
And that's why it's important to have the community to help them find that discernment.
The American Religious Town Hall is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here is your host and moderator.
Welcome, viewers. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Luxton, and I am the moderator for the program today. We have a team of panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves to you.
My name is Bishop Michael Olson, and I serve as the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
And I'm Tom Plumbley. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I serve as the senior minister at First Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, I'm Carl TROVALL. I'm professor of ethics and history at Concordia University in Austin, Texas, which is affiliated with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
And my name is Mel ROBECK. I'm Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. I'm also a minister with the Assemblies of God.
As you can see, we have a team of experts here today to discuss a very important topic. And here it is. We've heard many people say that they have been called by God to preach, or that God has a calling on their life to serve the homeless, or that God has called them to do this or that. Exactly what does it mean to be called by God? Also, does God call people who are non-clergy to do specific tasks? How can one distinguish between one's desire to be or do some specific work versus knowing if the desire is a result of a direct call upon his or her life? How is the church involved in this process? According to a recent Barna research poll, 56% of practicing Christians believe understanding their calling is a solo journey. This data, which is published in a book titled You on Purpose, sheds light on how U.S. adults, practicing Christians, and professional career coaches think about the process of discovering one's calling. There are many people who have not discovered what their purpose or calling in life is, and Barna believes that, quote, this research points to a major opportunity for church leaders to walk alongside members of their community as they discover their callings and move toward lives marked with deeper confidence, satisfaction, and a purpose, end of quote. Today we would like to hear from our panelists on this topic by asking them a few questions. First of all, according to your faith tradition, what does it mean to be called by God? Secondly, can you share with the audience a little bit about your call and how you knew it was God calling you or leading you to do what you do? And finally, should our religious institutions be involved in assisting people with their call, or is that an individual journey? We will turn back to our first two panelists who spoke and get their opinion on the topic.
Well, I could do this whole program myself, but but the fact of the matter is we need to share here. To be real honest with you, I mean, the word church, the Greek word church is ekklesia, which means essentially, it means the called out ones, the people who have been called. So all of us who are members of the body of Christ, all of us who are part of the church, have been called by God to do something. There's nobody that is without a call. The problem is trying to figure out what that call is. And I know that as a young person, I struggled greatly. It took me 8 years to get through college because I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to be doing with my life. I went through several different majors and I flunked out a couple of times. It was not an easy route. But the reality is, I found my call through other people in the community. Callings are not simply isolated things, generally speaking. They are done something that happens within the community of faith. People look at younger people and they say, you know what, you ought to think about. And that's exactly what happened to me. I had been teaching a Sunday school class of boys for a couple of years, and the parents of one of the kids came to me and said, you know, you're really a good teacher. Have you ever thought about teaching the Bible? It was like, boom. When the light went on, and I thought, no, I've never thought about that in my life. And I made the transition immediately to a theological program, and it absolutely moved me in a different direction. And then as I went through, this theological program, I thought I was going to be going into the field of New Testament. And as it turned out, the school where I was adjuncting or teaching part-time came to me and said, you know, we've just hired a full-time person in New Testament. We have no need of you. I said, well, what should I do? What should I do? I said, you know, my mentor right now is struggling with dementia, and he's not going to be there for me. I don't know what to do. And the dean said, if you'll become a church historian, I'll guarantee you a job when you're done. Oh, that's an easy thing to fulfill, you know. So it was an easy switch for me to go from New Testament to early church. Okay, that's how I did it. But the biggest thing for me was in the middle of the night, I had been struggling with a paper that I was supposed to be giving to a particular audience, and the Lord woke me up. I'm not one that's given to visions. He woke me up. I sat up and he says to me, Mel, I want you to speak about ecumenism. I said, I can't do that. I don't know anything about it. I've never read a book. I've never read an article. I've never talked with an ecumenist. I don't know anything about it. I went back to sleep, and he woke me up again. And I said, he said, same words. I said, you know, Lord, if I do that, I'm going to get in trouble with my church because we do not involve ourselves in ecumenism. I went back to sleep, and he woke me up again. And I said to myself, he's pretty persistent, you know? He's not going to let me off on this one. And my church had always taught me, you do whatever the Lord tells you to do. I said, okay, I'll do it. It changed my life. It changed the entire direction of my life. Do I use my New Testament? Absolutely. Do I use my church history? It's helped me to understand Bishop Olson better than I ever would have had I not studied church history, you know? And it really has helped, it has opened up my life to a richness that I never would have found before. When I think about young people struggling to find out what there are, I really think they need to take seriously the kinds of things that interest them. I think God gives us interests. He gives us passions. He gives us ideas. And I think we need to be very careful about putting those aside and entering into what He's calling us to do. It may change along the way. That's okay.
Thank you. Carl?
Thank you. I guess I don't need to say anything because you kind of already touched on. No, that was wonderful, Mel. I appreciate that. And I never had any kind of mystical experience like you had with God calling you like that as you're sleeping. Mine was far more pragmatic, and it was when I was struggling. I thought, because I love books so much, I was sitting with my professor, and I said, I think I want to be a librarian. And he says, oh, Carl, he said, that'd be such a waste. And I thought, well, that was really insulting. Like, what do you, he says, no, he said, you should think about teaching, like at a university. He said, because you need to be out in front of people. And it was such a funny comment, but in hindsight, I see those moments, right? And I think that that's a piece of it, is that it doesn't come with it came like that for you, but it didn't come like that for me. It came through this discernment you get from a variety of people. It's not a solo adventure. No. It's a discernment that you get from hearing what other people reflect back about what you believe how you can serve God. I think where I want to go is that Luther kind of transformed the kind of understanding of vocation in the Reformation affirmation by speaking that it isn't just church workers who have vocations, but it's everyone has a calling. A calling, vocation comes to the word voice, it's the same meaning. It's a calling, and you have to be called by whom, right? It isn't you're choosing whatever you're going to do, it's about being called out. And of course, the first calling, as you mentioned, is the ecclesia, called by God to be a member of the community of faith through the gospel. But Luther understood this calling to actually happen in 4 areas. We think of it primarily in career. Luther understood it to be happening in your family, so you have a calling as a parent or a child or a spouse. In the economic world, with your what we call your profession or your career. I hate the word career because that literally means rat race, right? It means race rather than. I'd rather be called than race. But your ecclesial, you still have a calling to your community of faith. That's another of your vocations. And then you have a 4th one, and that's the political, the common good of everyone. And that you really have many callings going on to different communities. But I think this is the piece I really want to emphasize. And that is, at least in the Lutheran tradition, calling is actually, your neighbor in need is God calling. Like, don't be looking for visions. Look for your neighbor in need. And if you see your neighbor in need and you have the ability to apply your talents to that situation, that's God calling you. And you need to listen to that. The neighbor in need is the strongest call of God.
Bishop Olson.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
We need to go to the guy who started to the school for the priesthood before he was 12 years old, right?
No, I was 14.
14, there we go.
I was a little later than others.
But
anyway.
Because I'm still trying to figure out what.
Well, no, it's there's a yearning, all right? And there's a sense that something that God can only fulfill. And God is such that he always is present in your neighbor. And I think I've heard the vocation described this way. It's where your deepest desires meet the world's greatest need.
Frederick Buechner.
You know, who said that?
Frederick Buechner.
Okay. I didn't, well, footnote right here. All right, good, yeah. There you see,
I read it in a book.
I think it's and the role of, I mean, God acts, and I think Mel's description is very beautiful, and I've had that type of experience where it's sort of a nagging, if you will, and then, it's that St. John of the Cross, people would come to him and say, Jesus appeared to me and told me to do this, and he'd say, ignore it. He said, if it's Jesus, he'll find you. He'll come again. And I think that's discernment. All right. And I think that you look at St. Paul, and St. Paul had a very dramatic call to conversion. He's knocked off a horse, and, he says, it relates that the voice of Christ said, why do you persecute me? And now you say, well, that's pretty definite and definitive. But he went into the desert and sought, what does this mean? And the discernment is required, and he requires the community to do that, and the church. And I think, especially from the Catholic tradition, baptism is a vocation. I always say, when people are at church in the day, I said, you're not here because of your own initiative. You're here because of the graced response God gave you. It's God's initiative that prompts us, and in selflessness, He lets us kind of, with our freedom, respond. And I think that's a sense of vocation. And I don't like the word career either, precisely because it is a race and it's something compelled. I think, though, a vocation involves that call, and it's marked by certain things. There's a generosity of spirit. There's service involved with it. It's an invitation, so there's a freedom to say no. That's not it's not a sin. You have to argue with God and about it, and then finally say yes when it feels right. There's a timing to it, and the timing is different for each person. I think, and it's marked by grace in that way, and by freedom. And I think for us in Catholic Church, marriage is a vocation. Not everybody is called to it. Now, there's also discernment with the community on that, as far as this is what marriage means. Are you willing to commit to that? And there's an expectation that, in a sense, the married couple, in a sense, makes present Christ's unconditional love for His church. Through forgiveness, through perseverance, through openness to life, all of those things, and that's a discernment that that takes time and ultimately takes faith.
Thank you. Have you worked it out yet, Tom?
Haven't worked it out yet. Yeah, there's a running joke in my family that Tom's still trying to figure out what he wants to do when he grows up, but you know that's a joke. Yeah, I want to go after two words that Carl used, one about himself and one about Mel, the mystical and the pragmatic. I really think, Carl, that that the mystical involves what you and I call the pragmatic. I believe that, or my experience is, that God calls us one step at a time. And, you know, even your experience of God in your bedroom, which is just something that's way beyond my experience, you know, you recounted all sorts of other things and other people and other voices through whom I believe God was speaking to you in just as mystical a manner as that one night. And so, yes, when someone comes to me with that kind of mystical experience, it's kind of like, yes, and factor that into everything else you know and have heard from God through all the other voices that God has, through whom God has spoken to you. You know, poor Jonah in that story in the Bible. Jonah's called to go do all sorts of good things for the bad guys in his life. And somewhere along the line, we need to realize that that's a part of our calling sometimes. To bring good news to the enemies. Paul talks about being set apart. Israel understood itself as a set apart sort of people. So this business of being set apart is both individual and communal. And yet my own tradition does not talk about us clergy being set apart in the way that I think many other traditions do. You know, we joke that some other traditions view clergy as a different, a third gender, a different sort of person. And we don't view it that way at all. But yes, my own experience was that I kept saying I was going to work in the church, but in the church where it affects public policy. And I thought that meant that I was going to be working in Washington, D.C. As a lobbyist. Never came about. Our church doesn't have jobs like that. I got a job in a local church, and after doing that for about 15 years, sitting down with those who were studying for ministry, helping them discern their call, I finally had to admit that yes, I too had been called to this ministry in local churches. And that was something, then I had to give up my old story about not knowing what I wanted to do when I grow up.
Thank you all. Time for a break.
We hope you're enjoying today's program. If you'd like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the vision and history of the program, and we invite you to become a ministry partner, explore our Town Hall Estates healthcare facilities, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, we look forward to receiving your letters. You may write us at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. If you have a prayer request, please send it to prayerrequest@americanreligious.org. Thank you for writing and thank you for watching. Now, back to today's closing statements.
Welcome back, everybody. My background is English, and so I love just stories. So I've just been sitting back here, just listening to the stories today, and I hope they've been as inspiring to you as they have been to me. And now we're going to ask our panelists for some closing statements.
I think for a vocation or a calling, one of the things that we overlook generally, I think, in our society and just the way we do things, is something that's essential to vocation, and that's listening. Listening is very key to discipleship. Listening for the voice of God, caring enough to find Him, to hear Him in the poor, to hear Him in the words of Scripture. More than just simply hearing, listening means kind of returning to what I said. The image scripturally that comes to mind is the call of Samuel. 3 times, Eli, did you call me? Did you call me? And then finally, he said, maybe it was the Lord. It takes Eli to say that. And then also we look at the prophets. You've got Isaiah, here I am, Lord, send me. And then you've got Jeremiah, I'm too young for this. And there's also, from listening, there's discourse and dialogue with God, with prayer. And then it always involves other people, the confirmation of that. It's never something that's just simply the extension of the ego. It's not an issue of entitlement, and it's certainly not the actualization of one's own personality.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I counseling young people a lot, and they're struggling with what they should do with their lives, and so it's a common theme. And I think there's one other angle, and that is that I think sometimes it isn't a matter of even feeling called. Sometimes it's just going out and doing something that you have to do, and you surprisingly find out that you are actually kind of decent at it. Because I remember the first time I worked at McDonald's, I got asked to be a manager, and I was like, okay, I'm not interested in being a manager, but thank you very much. And then I worked at Taco Bell, and they asked me to be a manager, and I said, okay, I'm not interested in that. That was in and then I worked at Michael's right before I got married, and my wife and I both worked there, and before we were married, and they asked me to be a manager, and it was like, what is going on here? I'm just like, all I'm trying is just trying to get a job done and get my seminary taken care of. And then at Concordia, I was asked to be dean. And I'm thinking, okay, the one thing I realized over that whole course of time was that I really don't feel any calling to be an administrator or a manager. I still, in a lot of ways, don't. But I have a knack for it. And so sometimes I think it's just developing the skills first in something, and you'll find that it opens up all doors. And so my point is your calling changes through life. You find doors open up because you prepared yourself in a certain way that you thought was just irrelevant. Yeah. And then lo and behold, it wasn't.
Yeah, I think you've made a lot of good points there. When I think of young people, I think, God has given them inclinations. He's given natural abilities. He's given talents. He's given gifts. He's given aptitudes. And, it's a confluence of all of these things that come together. And other people often see that before we do. And that's where the body really is extremely important. And I would say that couple that came to me and said, you ought to think about teaching the Bible. That was amazing to me. And it was a very pragmatic decision to move into church history rather than New Testament. I mean, I had an offer of a job, a promise of a job, which I never ultimately took. Because I ended up getting hired at Fuller. But what I want to make very clear is that this is not a solo adventure. It's not something, my experience is not something that is very common It's a very, especially the bedside, when the Lord appears to me at the end of the bed and talks to me, wakes me up 3 times. You know, I mean, it reminds me of Samuel. I always wondered, why did I have to be woken up 3 times? It was just, I don't know. But in any case,
Do you want us to answer that?
what I found was that when I entered into that particular element of my calling, my church had a very difficult time with that. And I got nasty phone calls, I got nasty letters, I got threats, I got all kinds of things from people that are part of my community because they didn't understand the calling. Now, I understood the calling. That was clear. Jesus told me to do this, and I'm going to do it. But I had to be sufficiently humble and submissive, and it took 30 years, but they've completely changed their minds about ecumenism at this point.
Thank you. And I appreciate Mel for sticking with that calling, because without him, a whole sector of Christianity would still be stuck thinking that the rest of us are just going down a rat hole somewhere.
Well, mostly.
My experience is greatly informed by the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who spoke of God when he spoke of God as having input in every occasion, every instant, every opportunity of life, and that's what each of us needs to understand. God is calling us in each moment, step by step. Plus, I think we also need to reflect on the statement that Jesus made about His own calling, understanding if we're to be like Him, that we need to look at that statement in Luke 4:16 and following about what the calling from God is indelibly, how it's indelibly wrapped up in helping other people.
Thank you. And the Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory but in reality. And now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.